Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video I'll be continuing my Stormlight Reread series with, of course, Words of Radiance, Book 2 in the Stormlight Archive by Sanderson. Now, if you didn't see the last video, I do want to know really quick, this is a video intended for those who have already read the book Words of Radiance, as this is going to be going through kind of giving a summary of the big points, talking through different important pieces, bits of foreshadowing, important bits here and there will be spoilers for the entire book. However, I will be trying to avoid any spoilers for Oathbringer, anything that comes after Words of Radiance, keeping it just per book, so that if you've read this book, you are okay to watch the video. With that though, this is going to be also a very long video like the video for Way of Kings, so I'm just going to jump right into it. So, the prologue gives us another look at the night of Gavilar's assassination, and we see Jasna seeing her first glimpses of Shadesmar, and also getting ready to hire an assassin to kill Elhokar's wife, which is interesting because we don't really see why she might have wanted to do that for quite some time, but it sets it up and gives us something to look at. Plus, in general, it's really interesting seeing this event that's so important from another angle. We've seen kind of a couple of different angles now of it, and we'll see another one in Oathbringer as well, but giving us an extra look there. Getting into the main story with Chapter 1, we see Shallan starting to really get the first hints of her power and building a strong relationship with Jasna. First, she starts with her illusions, and of course we'll learn much more. I also really liked the Xanthid because it was a really cool drawing, and it continued to explore the idea of the relationship of Spren with Great Shells, so really interesting there. We get to Kaladin, and not exactly a surprise, but he's still struggling with anger, struggling with trusting Dalinar, and really just having trouble adjusting to his new life. And meanwhile, the other men that came with him from Bridgefor are really embracing the camaraderie, the setup that he really put into place, even though he's still struggling in some ways. We do, back with Jasna and Shallan, get our first look at pattern, and we get a really nice discussion of the nature of Spren and Shadesmar, really digging and doing some further world building. It's extremely important the further and further we get, so the more we learn about Spren, Shadesmar, that sort of thing, it really helps out. It's good to have early on. We then go to Dalinar's vision, which is one of the most paramount pieces here, because every time he has a vision, we also see written on the wall a countdown to the Everstorm. Now, is this the most original way to build tension? Not necessarily, but it absolutely works. You always know that end date is coming, and it's not going to be good when it does. But in the vision, he is in the middle of a desolation, and he sees these creatures of stone. They're called thunderclasts, and he's really fighting these and knows that he only has now 62 days until the Everstorm. Kaladin continues on really with his struggles, but starts to trust Dalinar a little bit more. We get a point of view from Sidious, which I really liked, because it humanized him. It did not try to make him a good person. He's still not a good person at all. He really is pretty crappy, but we get to see that, you know, he is still a person, and we saw a little bit into why he does what he does. Kaladin starts taking over more guard duties. He's going to be in charge of not only Dalinar's guards, but also the King's guards, and Dalinar decides he's going to try to refound the Knights Radiant and unite the war camps, still looking at this scale of uniting Elhokkar. So we continue learning about pattern. We do get more of the first glimpse of the full-on light weaving ability with Shallan, and in general, it's interesting to see kind of what she can do, and this is something too where we get a lot of Shallan in this book, and she was the character that I just wasn't fully feeling in book 1, and that completely changes here because we continue to see it. And we have, of course, the really big event, Jasna's death. She is killed by assassins who took over the ship, and Shallan desperately soul casts the ship to change it to water so that her and the sailors that are being murdered can potentially escape, even though there's not really a great chance of that anyway. Back at the war camps, Dalinar has mandated that joint assaults need to be happening. It's not really going great. The High Princes just still really don't want to unite. They like to compete with everything, and he's not really sure how to get this moving forward, especially when his old friend, Sidious, had betrayed him. We then see Kaladin and Sil really discussing what it means to be a Radiant, and why And also this scene shows why it was so important to have Kaladin's book first. He needed to go through so much to even be a functioning character, and he couldn't have gone through the first book without having all of those things happen and continued on. Shallan was at a point where she had actually made it further than Kaladin in a lot of ways and was able to go on without us kind of knowing everything, but with Kaladin it was needed, and I still think was such the right choice to use him for the first book. Speaking of Shallan, though, we then get some flashbacks, and we immediately start to see that we're going to see her core trauma here. And there are a lot of hints that perhaps she actually killed her mother with the shard blade. That is, of course, pattern versus what's always been thought by literally everyone else that her father did. We do see a chapter icon change here as well, changing up her pattern a little bit. So I think that kind of shows her growth in general and her changes happening also. So she's shipwrecked. She had soulcasted the ship, and she ends up trying to soulcast fire. It's not working. It's just struggling, still not really confident in her abilities. And we get the return of, I don't really know how to pronounce the name, but the slaver Tilak. I'm going to go with Tilak. And we get to see once again a minor character returning in a completely different scenario. And she kind of bullies her way into having him take her to the Shattered Plains. We then go back to another person struggling with learning their surge binding, and that's Kaladin. And he's starting to get better with some things, still has a lot to learn with others, but he is so afraid of letting the secret out. And then especially building up more, we hear Amaran is coming. And that's something that continues on in this book, but Sanderson does such a great job with these kind of set-piece scenes. We see things that's more like, okay, this is just kind of happening, and then bam, he throws in this last-minute thing to kind of build the tension back up. So he's still getting a lot of world building, a lot of things done, character growth, but also making sure that the tension is still there, and it most certainly is. That was the end of part one. With the interludes, we get some really important information, and the first one is our biggest part with Eshni so far. She'll have, I know, Rhythm of War is going to be her book for the flashbacks, but we get our first really kind of large section with Eshni, and we learn so much about the listeners, the name that the Parshendi use for themselves. We learn more about their different forms, which we obviously had some inkling of, but we kind of learn more how it works, how they fuse with Spren and actually change forms during high storms. We learn a little bit more about their fear of their gods coming back, and that is why they killed Gavilar. We'd always kind of heard that in bits and pieces, but it is confirmed here pretty well, and then we'll dig deeper in the next book as well. But we also find out they apparently do have an understanding of Surge Binding and Honor Blades based on some of their songs, so they might not really know completely what's going on, but at least the old listeners that the songs came from were somewhat aware because they have information on it. And we see our first hints that they're going to be looking at Stormform, an old form of power, even though a lot of people are nervous that this will bring their old gods back, the thing that they really wanted to avoid and even killed Gavilar over. Next up is Ym, and this is another really important piece in the interludes because we see Ym, who's a surge binder, and he's a generally good guy. You know, he's trying to heal children, give them shoes, but he's executed for a crime he committed in his past by somebody with a shard blade. And we have the theme of justice, and this is touched on a bit more later in this book and really hard later in Edge Dancer, but we see that this is actually one of the Heralds, the leader of the Skybreakers, and he is apparently going around and killing Surgebinders. So really important there as well. When you get to Rysn, I commented in the first video, I really liked her story overall, and this is a really big part of it. Going to the Reshi Isles, getting world building there for this other completely different area on Roshar that we've not really heard anything from. I do feel like there's a little bit of a Discworld nod with the whole great shells with people living on top. Could be wrong, but I know Sanderson read Discworld. I also still wonder if the Rayshadium is a nod to the Rainhin from Thomas Covenant, but that's neither here nor there. But in this in general, we're getting the world building, we're getting this really cool set piece, but there are some important things that are put in there as well. We see an Amian again, and they're still very mysterious, but there's something going to be going on with them. You can just tell it's building to something where they're going to be very important. And we also learn once again more about the nature of Spren and Great Shells, because there seems to be some very close link with that, and that's something that's continues to be explored and seems like it's going to be important later as well. Plus, we see a Larkin, and we don't learn what the Larkin does right off the bat, but this interesting creature that's apparently extremely valuable, which is just a little breadcrumb, once again, for later also, and will probably end up being important again. We do end with Eshonai again, and she's very worried for her people, and she really gets humanized here because you see that she is the one who wants peace. They did what they had to do. They didn't, want to kill Gavilar, but she's trying to figure out if there's a way to have peace. And in the end, she agrees to try out Stormform just so that nobody else has to risk themselves. So she's sacrificing herself in order to do it. So it's really interesting the way that it kind of turns the tables on the Parshendi. We had bits of that with her reviews before, but not as much. With the epigraphs in general, in the first part, we saw Navani's journal also setting up the tension of what's to come. She's writing a journal entry afterwards. And then in part 2, we get excerpts from the songs of the listeners. So once again, learning more about them in a really cool way and seeing a bit more of what they actually know. Getting into part 2, Shallan's heading to the Shattered Plains, and she's dealing with the loss of Yasna. And we see lots of different things happen to her on her way. This is a significant part of what she's doing, but the big thing is figuring out her light weaving a little bit more. She ends up running to some deserters, including Gaz, once again taking a minor character that we didn't get a ton of development into, but we saw a little, and putting him in a very different situation. And she ends up leading these soldiers and leading the slavers on the way, and eventually even fighting off bandits, convincing them, and getting pulled in pretty deep with the assassin who actually killed Yasna, who also appears to be associated with the Ghostbloods. So quite a lot happens in her part there as well, but there are also some things that we learn through that also. One, we find out with greater confirmation, it's been heavily hinted at, but that the Radiants did kill their Spren. Presumably this is where Shard Blades and Plate came from, so that's something that's pretty important. We do see more, again, of Shallan's repressed memories as well, and through flashbacks we find out that Halloran was a Shard Bearer, which also very important in general. And really kind of just seeing her grow in her power with the practice, seeing her effect not only to change who she is, but to transform, and it is transform other people by the way that she's sketching them and showing people who they could be, and kind of shows the combination of the lie, the truth, that light weavers are. So something that it's interesting to see throughout her parts as well. We do back with Kaladin also see a couple of really interesting scenes where he's clashing with Adolin and Zahil in general while they are trying to do some training and stuff there. And we get some cool pieces here, but seeing him kind of try to just go after Adolin because he's mad and his powers stop working, and Syl says to him, "Who were you protecting?" And that starts to really show the idea that the Nahel bond, as it's called, is really important. The Spren make the bond, and certain oaths, certain rules do have to be followed, and that's up to the Spren. So it kind of shows that even though the people that end up being Radiants aren't always perfect by any means, if they want to advance, if they want to continue moving forward, use the powers, there are some rules here, so important there. Zahil, of course, being another world hopper who we get a lot of hints based on his curses and phrases involving colors on where he comes from as well, and then it's, I think, very much confirmed a little bit later on toward the end of the book, of course, as well. We do get the note as well, too, that Spren are pieces of God, which is really important because even though Syl is specifically an honor spread, makes sense that she'd be a part of honor, it does explain kind of more in general that the Spren are these living ideas that are manifestations of the investiture of the Stormlight, the pieces of honor in general. Moving on, we also do see another attempted assassination on Elkar, and this ends up setting up a very large plot point, but not really surprising that more people are trying to assassinate him. And it's around this point we actually start to get the first hints about Reread being a Surgebinder, just based on some of the other things that he says and does and the way he interacts. Makes it seem like he very likely is, and that's something that we see and get a little bit more confirmation on later as well. We get more Shallan flashbacks and really delving deeper into her family turmoil. One brother who just gambles, the other who tortures small creatures and gremlins and starting fires, and just obviously a very, very broken household. And then we get the first of what will be several more interactions between Kaladin and Shallan, which is really fun just because their characters tend to clash quite a lot, and it's really fun seeing them interact. We have this whole ridiculous thing where Shallan's pretending to be a horn eater and demands Kaladin's boots, practicing conning with Tin, who she had kind of fallen into with, part of the Ghostbloods, because she's trying to still keep in that role. And we start to see as well, CD is plotting to take power. We get to see point of view from him again, which is also still really nice. I do like to see his point of views, even though it is so different. And he really, in general, is just the complete opposite of Dalinar. We see them look at the past completely different ways. He's proud of what he did. He wants to go back to the conquest and the fighting, and Dalinar is disgusted by what's happened in the past. And so this kind of core fundamental change from people who used to be probably pretty similar is really building and showing where that gap came from and why it's probably not going to be able to be closed. We do Shallan continually kind of thinking about different sides of herself, who she can be, and this sets up huge plot points in the next book as well with her light weaving. So as Shallan nears the Shattered Plains, there's a lot going on there as well. We see Seth, the infamous assassin in white, return, and he breaks into the palace, cuts in through a hole, is trying to assassinate, we assume, Elhokar, and come to find out it's actually Dalinar. And we see Adolin and Dalinar fighting, trying to keep him from the king. Kaladin, of course, there is fighting as well, until they figure out that it is Dalinar he's actually trying to kill, and we get the amazing scene of Dalinar catching the shard blade, because he doesn't have one at the time, and is still trying to fight. And then eventually Kaladin and him fighting, falling out of the window, falling hundreds of feet, and surviving. And Seth can't believe that Kaladin can actually use Stormlight, because that would mean he was right when he said Surge Binding, and when he said the Voidbringers were coming back, he wouldn't really be truthless. But Kaladin confirms, thinking it seems the right thing to do, that the Radiants are back. It's all true. He's been lied to. And this sets up just a breaking point for Seth. So already ending with a pretty awesome scene, but there's still one more to go. We then see Shallan get confirmation that Tin was in charge of the group that did assassinate Yasna, and they end up scuffling, and she actually ends up killing Tin with her living Shardblade pattern. The first time we actually see that transformation in that way, and then she agrees via the Spanreed to meet the Ghostbloods herself, and that gets us to the end of part 2. So a lot going on, really action-packed part 2. In the interludes, we go back, we see Eshonai, and she is in the High Storm, transforming to Stormform, and then she realizes too late after the Stormfather speaks to her that this is a huge mistake. Then we get a viewpoint from Zahel. We get more confirmation that he's a World Hopper and Cosmere Ware. He also mentions a voice talking in his head, and that pretty well tells us that he's talking about Nightblood and who he is, that he's Vasher from the world of Warbreaker as well. So just really interesting, once again, the tidbits of putting these characters in with the hints that if you've read the other books really seem to be pretty well there, but if you haven't, you may completely miss, and that's still okay, it doesn't hurt the story. We see then Talonel, and he is the Herald who had come back at the end of the first book. He's talking to Unlisting Years, he's mumbling about the desolation coming. He is just completely insane and just broken after thousands of years of the torture, damnation, waiting for the desolation. We jump back to Eshonai again. She now has the trademark red eyes of the Voidbringing, and she is joined now with a Spren of Odium. And she hears this internal voice, which is her, screaming, railing against what's happening, but is now under the control, more so, and the influence of Odium and his Spren. Getting into part 3, there is a lot going on as well. We get to see Navani practicing with Fabrial science, which is a really interesting world-building thing, because the Fabrials in general are super interesting. We don't always get a ton into them, but something that's noted specifically, and this is touched on a couple times here in foreshadowing moments in this book, that Spren captured in stones usually are what actually is powering most of these Fabrials. And so this is something that in general is involved with potentially how the Great Shells have Sprens that are associated with them and their gem hearts, and how the Parshendi associate with Sprens by trapping them as well. So we see Shallan finally actually arrive at the Shattered Plains. We get a confrontation with Kaladin and Gaz, which was really interesting to see. And just once again, I was glad they brought Gaz back because I thought there was a lot that could have been done with the character, and so I loved seeing it. We see Adolin getting set up for his biggest duel yet, dueling again very regularly. Shallan telling everybody about what happened to Yasna, and then ends up saying that her relation, Fabrial, the High Prince that we haven't really seen yet, who's just very rude and crude, is going to have her stay there, which is completely untrue, but he ends up going with it and giving us a really interesting, different take on a different High Prince who is completely different from the others, but also still effective in his own way. We get more flashbacks with Shallan, the High Prince and his son wanting to do an inquest to look into the death of Shallan's mother, since she was a light-eyed woman. We see Shallan with Fabrial and his mistress, Pelona, who is dark-eyed, which is why they're not formally married, even though they basically are, and I honestly just love those two characters. They were so well done. It's once again, even though there's a lot of really heavy action-packed things, there's a lot of darker plots going on here, but you get these great moments of levity, and the way that there's so many of these characters put in, it just makes it super enjoyable for me. Some people might not like it. I certainly did. We get, then, from there, Kaladin once again training more research binding, and realizing that Moash definitely tried to kill Elhokar, which sets him up for his two branching directions. He's trying to follow Dalinar, protect him and the king, but he also completely feels and understands Moash as well, and that's his closest friend from the bridge cruise. Shallan, able to now do a full light weaving disguise, sets her meeting with the Ghostbloods, and they're kind of very mysterious. There's not a ton of info really going on yet, but we have the first kind of looks that maybe Moash might be involved with this group. We know he's definitely involved with somebody, but there seems to be a couple of comments made that make it sound like they might be aware of him at least, if nothing else. Kaladin training more so again, Moash kind of coming clean and admitting what he did and doing it because he wants to recruit Kaladin to also help. We once again see more Shallan flashbacks, and she's trying to help her brothers. And something, too, that shows about her character, where she's definitely a very damaged character, but she's always trying to help others, put on a good face, make things better. And I think that plays in as well with her being the Lightweaver who can change things and show things the way they could be, playing into that whole step as well. We see her meet Hoyd, very briefly, going by a different name at that point as well. But meeting him and him kind of encouraging her along in a similar way to how he encouraged Kaladin along in Book 1. So once again, seeing what he's been up to this whole time, definitely around, always doing something. And we do see then Kaladin actually meet with Moash and the assassins per his request. And they once again want his help. And it's a really tough decision for him. Which side is he going to go on? So, finally being in the Shattered Plains, Shallan is able to begin researching her through the Oath Gates, the Dawn Chant, and Light Weaving, and her research ends up being paramount to some things that are going to happen. Then we get another flashback with her, really seeing her father's rage come out, her brother's despondency, and all of their problems again. And just still going deeper and deeper, and it seems like we keep showing worse and worse things before getting even to the final thing in general. Shallan and Adolin do start courting. They had kind of had the betrothal that was set up by Yasna, and Shallan wants to actually start researching the Shattered Plains as well. She knows Yasna thought there was something important out there that might relate to Urthuru, and so trying to convince Adolin to take her out as well. We go back to Adolin and Dalinar, and more numbers are scratched, counting down as well. And really we see, once again, Shallan and Kaladin kind of interacting as well. Anytime they're around, we see it, because he clashes with Adolin as well, but Shallan he also does. And we see the very, very different ways that they handle their characters. They both have had a lot of stuff happen, but he's kind of just this angry at the world, and she's always trying to put on a happy face type person. And the tension between them, the tension with the countdown, having their two books right next to each other, just sets up a really interesting motif. We didn't have Adolin meet Eshonai as Dalinar, trying to talk of peace, but it's too late. Eshonai has been put into Stormform, and they no longer want peace. They want to now annihilate the Alethi, setting up what we see where the countdown is going to be going for sure. We continue the Shallan Kaladin parallel with how they use their surge binding in different ways as well. In general, So we see Kaladin, who's just trying to figure out how to fight, do this, do that, and we see Shallan, who's doing these very subtle different things, once again trying their characters. But we do find out that Amaran's Shardblade and plate came from Helrin, Shallan's brother, who we knew was the Shardbearer, and we knew was killed. But this is where it's actually confirmed that that was the one who killed. And so Shallan, of course, thinks Amaran killed him, where we know it was really Kaladin. Next, we do get Adolin setting up his big duel, which will be handicap him versus what he thinks are two others, setting up one of my favorite scenes. And then we go to Shallan meeting with the Ghostbloods, meeting Graves, and escaping the murder attempt they try to put on her, where they make it very clear that she's not a member and they may still kill her even though they're going to send her on missions. And so she's really starting to realize the gravity of the situation that she is in. We then get to see Kaladin, Shallan, Adolin, and even Wit at a circus and kind of looking around. This reminds Shallan of when she had first met Wit, and Adolin doesn't seem super impressed with it, but we see everyone kind of looking, having different reactions. This, once again, this really interesting set piece to see how each person reacts to the different events around them. We see Kaladin jealous of Adolin and Shallan. We get the metaphor of the caged white spine, and we kind of see all of these different things. So it's done well. We get to learn a little bit more about the history of Shallan Wit, a little more about how all these characters would interact, and what we have this being set up, and you're like, oh, this is cool, not a lot's happening, but it's interesting. And bam, Sanderson throws in the fact that Dalinar is making Amaran the first Knight Radiant. And from there, we go from the set piece with the big reveal to one of the best action parts, what I said. It ends up being Adolin actually 4 versus 1, and he's fighting like never before, trying to do everything he can to try to help. Reread jumps out to try to fight again, but he just can't move. When he holds a shard blade, he just kind of freezes. Once again, more points that he's probably a Searchbinder as well. He's just not as far yet. And Shallan sends Pattern to try to distract some of them, and it's just this terrible fight. Kaladin, of course, because it's Kaladin, joins this epic fight, and together they actually do defeat them in just a fantastic way. And the idea was that Adolin was going to ask for a boon, which was to duel Sidious right here and right now. But Kaladin asks for a boon as well, and asks to duel Amaran, and accuses him right there of murder and treachery, and is arrested. And we end here on such a dark note after the big action scene, where Kaladin really feels betrayed, and Dalinar in a way feels betrayed by Kaladin and him doing that and messing up their plans. We see Sidious is escalating. He's ready to just completely crush Dalinar. He sees he was almost outmaneuvered, and this is a turning point for Kaladin as well, for the worse. He had a lot of growth in book 1, but he's still very damaged, and this kind of what he feels, this betrayal, sets him back quite a lot to a worse place like he was in book 1. And that's the end of part 3. In the interludes, I'm going to try to go quickly here. First we see Lift, and there is just a ton to pack here. First of all, we know that we're going to look at her in Edge Dancer, which I'll be doing a video on as well. We see her Sprin Wendell, who is just, for one, it's such a great foil to her because he's very prim, proper, and serious, and she is, you know, a young girl and extremely just immature, obviously. She's like 10 years old or 13 years old, one of the two at this point, I can't remember which. And we see, though, that Wendell has kept more knowledge of Searchbinding and kind of what's going on, something that he was prepared for. He's a Spren of Cultivation, or the Night Watcher, so not on the side of honor as well, so shows more information there as well. We get a call back to the Herald destroying art, and I realized when I was rereading the first book I forgot who that was, but then it's the callback again to her face being scratched out, so Shalash going and destroying any likenesses of her. We see that again with it, so another Herald out here and there. And we then see Nail, or Nin, he's called a few different things, but the Herald that she calls Darkness, who is coming and filling out all his forms to try to kill her, basically. And it really sets it all up through events that end up happening. She ends up causing her friend Gon to become the new leader of Azir, but we get a lot of Azir world building in general, seeing how everything's bureaucracy and how everything works. So much going on there in a lot of different ways, and this seems like such a throwaway character that he actually turns into a very important character as well. So interesting there. And then we see Seth, and he's just, hanging out in Earthuru just casually, even though literally nobody knows where it is. Was a really cool thing to see for such a short passage. Just kind of like, what? And he ends up deciding maybe he's done following his Oathstone. He doesn't know what to believe anymore as well. We go back to Eshonai. She's just now completely consumed by the new form with the Spren of Odium, the Storm Spren. And there's all these new negative rhythms where it's all these kind of more violent or angry emotions instead of the regular ones. And she starts the process of transforming tens of thousands into Stormform so that they can call a storm and destroy the Alethi. Jumping back then into part 4, we start with Kaladin in prison, and Wit visits him again. This once again, it's a kind of a darker point for Kaladin, but I absolutely love the line where Wit says, "A bunny rabbit and a chick went frolicking in the grass together on a sunny day." Kaladin's just so confused, like, what does that mean? And he says, "Sorry, let me make it more appropriate for you. A piece of wet slime and a disgusting crab thing with 17 legs slunk across the rocks together in an insufferably rainy day." And I love that. It's one of my favorite things Wit says, just in general. It makes me laugh quite a lot, but kind of telling him his story and trying to push him in the right direction. Shallan is improving in her light weaving, but it's hinted that she had done it before and was able to do a lot of the stuff that she's rediscovering. She just has to admit it to herself because she's blocked out those memories. And we delve deeper into Shallan's father, see her desperately trying to hold her family together in the flashbacks in general, even with everything going on, her feeling really responsible for so much because of what happened and because of what her father has now done based on what's happened. We find out that it was actually Rysn, who was obviously very important for Kaladin's life, who was responsible for the death of Moshe's grandparents, and Moshe actually blames the king because he was involved as well. And Kaladin agrees that, you're right, Elhokar needs to die for the better of Roshar, the better for Alethkar. So, big turning point here as well. From there, we see Shallan on a mission for the Ghostbloods with Ayatil, and they're supposed to investigate claiming to be Dalinar, the Herald, who we know actually is, even though most people don't believe him. And based on the success of this mission, she's told she is now a member of the Ghostbloods. And we start to see Syl deteriorating as well as Kaladin's in his dark place. And so it's kind of like Shallan's moving forward and Kaladin's very much moving back. And we see, too, with a flashback scene for Shallan that really kind of just puts it in perspective, is her mother-in-law, who gets beat very badly by her father because she found out they were going to try and run and escape. As Shallan is trying to help her, her mother-in-law says to her, "Why doesn't he ever do it to you and be you, the one who actually deserves it?" And just this horrible moment, and Shallan kind of knows deep down that she did cause all of this, but really just, man, the emotional impact there is really, really good. Getting back to a little bit of a happier area for Kaladin, he is freed. He found out apparently Adolin also kept himself in captivity, better captivity, but in protest of Kaladin being locked up. He gifts shards to Kaladin. Kaladin once again turns them down, but he gives them to Moshe, which really shows he has made his decision, even though he knows it's probably not a great idea. We move on from there to Dalinar at a feast and find out Sidious has released copies of his visions. They've been changed to make him look even worse. And Dalinar confronts it head on, which is a pretty Dalinar thing to do. And we do get a confirmation here as well, where we find out that Hoid/Wit does confirm he is against Odium. And we could probably surmise that, but with him, you never know. So actually outright saying it, I thought was just a good note to have. Then get to see Adolin, Shallan, Kaladin. Man, those names are all too similar when you say them like that. All interacting on a scout mission. And Kaladin spots Sidious's assassin just a little too late. He and Shallan, along with some other soldiers, end up falling into the chasms. So here they're kind of forced to interact more, which, like I said, I really like their interactions because they just tend to clash quite a lot. And they really continue this. But we get good points made about Kaladin's character, where Shallan kind of just points out the way he is. Even though he's had bad stuff happening to him, he chooses to be angry and mad about everything instead of trying to be better. And then a Chasm Fiend is coming, so they don't really have a lot of time to keep going and have to make a run for it. But we see them interacting, we start to see the seeds of them understanding each other, and them starting to actually bond over their own dark pasts, because Kaladin has just assumed that Shallan is this spoiled light-eyes like everyone else he knows, and never even thought about the fact that she had all these things that happened. So she starts to actually tell him some of the things that happened that she's never really talked about with anybody, and he tells some of his story as well. And it gets to the point where he decides he's going to sacrifice himself and try to kill the Chasm Fiend, and then Shallan gives him her Shard Blade, which brings us to, once again, just interesting interactions. So we see Kaladin trying to fight the Chasm Fiend, and he's actually not doing so well, even though he's the fighter, the soldier. Shallan's light weaving actually makes a huge difference, and is using that to try to help. And she also then is actually able to use the blade in general to cut like a cubby, changing to a knife the first time we see it there. But half almost by accident, Kaladin ends up being able to kill the Chasm Fiend that's trying to eat him, and he just kind of sticks the blade up. So it was still a really cool scene. But we get to see more about how the Shard Blades actually work when it's a living Shard Blade. Going to the flashbacks, we see Shallan's father finally going too far, killing her stepmother, destroying the legs of one of her brothers, and so we see finally where she tries to poison him, and it doesn't work. So then she's slowly strangling him while singing the lullaby that he sang to her after she killed her mother. And my gosh, such a haunting scene. And it's from there that they continue to share their stories as they wait out the high storm, and she doesn't tell all of it, and neither does he. So there's the little bits like she doesn't know that he actually killed Hellerin, and he doesn't know her darkest secrets as well. But then we see at the end of part 4 they return. Dalinar thinks that Kaladin is a Radiant, but he says he's not anymore because he had lost that with his lack of acting honorably, and something he couldn't actually use in the chasms. And then we see some tension between Adel and Shallan, kind of setting up a potential love triangle type situation later on as well. Into the interludes, we see Lan, and through the point of view here of this Ardent, we see the Queen's poor leadership, and the fact that most of the Ardents are corrupt, and just kind of try to live in opulence while others suffer. So Dalinar was probably pretty right to worry about it, and a new Ardent Pie condemns the Queen and is executed after very publicly writing all of the different things that the Queen has done, and riots start at a very poor time for Kholinar. We see Eshonai again planning to bring the Everstorm. They're going to wait until the Alethi march on them. And then finally, we get Taravangian, and there's just so much info in this longer point of view for him. We learn about the diagram, his boon curse from the Night Watcher, where he wanted the capacity to save the world. So he'll be smart or dumb on a scale different every day, randomly. And there was one day he had just unparalleled brilliance, was able to predict a lot of what was going to happen and figure so many things out. He knew about Jasnah and Shallan, and from the things he says, it sounds like Hellerin actually might have been a Surge Binder as well, and that was something that they were aware of. He had this whole thing planned to take over Ya'Kaved. He knew of Gavilar's visions. Apparently Gavilar actually told him about them, and he's now trying to actually unite Roshar on the other side, though he sees Dalinar as a threat because there can't be competing forces, even though Dalinar is trying to do essentially the same thing. We also learn about some of the ancient evil spren, like Moloch, which causes the death rattle, which those little bits of prophecy when someone's dying, and Neragul, I'm going to say, I'm not sure if that's the right pronunciation, who causes the thrill, kind of more confirming that feeling that amps up people wanting to fight and kill is coming from this evil spren. So something interesting there too, and I think to keep in mind with Dalinar later on also. So the last epigraphs were a reply to Hoid's letter, begging him not to intervene, and then we see that there just are a lot of big forces in play at Roshar, and a lot going on with it as well, and something very important with their particular struggle. The next epigraphs are pieces of the diagram, which once again just start showing how much Taravangian and the people who follow him actually know. Getting now toward the end here, we see Dalinar prepping the march, and Fabrial and Royan are actually the only ones to initially join him, where he was pretty surprised to see that it was them. And then we see Aladar, despite being a huge Sidious supporter, joining as well, thinking that this is the honorable thing. He's not going to sit back. And then we actually get the Kaladin-Amaran confrontation, where we find out that Dalinar was setting up something to prove Amaran was a fraud all along, and does so, even though Kaladin had kind of given up on that. We see Shallan and Navani finally working together to try to figure out what the answer is, essentially, to all the questions of where are they going to find this Oathgate. Kaladin trying to figure out what to do, because he still knows Mosh is planning on killing the king, so he's still kind of in there, still doesn't have Syl or any of his powers. Shallan does confide her secret in Dalinar, and then the Alethi first run into the Parshendi with Stormform as well. We then get to see Shen/R'lain coming back, and he surrenders, and he was a spy, and he came back and saw what was happening to his people. He wanted nothing to do with it, and he comes back and confirms that the listeners are gone, and it's monsters now, and he decides he will help them find the Middle Plateau and find them, because he is terrified of them at this point. And then we see something, too, which was just such an interesting scene, because we see Elhokar actually come to Kaladin, who is so much below him, and reaches out, and he admits that he knows his failings, and he wants to be better, and he's asking Kaladin to just teach him what it means to be a hero, and how to do a good job. And Kaladin kind of rebuffs him, but just showing really that, he is not a great king, but he's trying. He really is trying in general, and it's kind of hard with it. And that's where he gets the realization that Elhokar is Dalinar's version of Tien, his younger brother, the person who really was trying, even though they just weren't able to quite do it. And that's where he kind of realizes what needs to happen. Out deep in the Shattered Plains, the battle is beginning. They're fighting not only the Parshendi, but also lightning, and they're chanting, trying to bring apart the storm. Shallan's desperately trying to find the Oathgate. The battle is not going good, but Adolin has a plan. He ends up cutting through some hollow buildings to get right out and to take out all the listeners who were trying to call the storm, trying to do that as well. Navani is using these interesting Fabrials to pull up tarps and have places for archers to go, and Kaladin decides he is going to try to protect Elhokar anyway, and even though he's injured still because he hasn't been able to heal, he goes to get Elhokar, who's drunk, and as they're trying to leave, he runs into Mosh and Graves. Time is running short on the Shattered Plains, and Dalinar's force is keeping even, but the storm is approaching, and the Stormfather says he won't help, but he'll bring a high storm to wash away their bodies after they all die, so not the greatest vote of confidence. But we go back to Kaladin then and say he will not let Mosh kill Elhokar. And we get to see Kaladin as well say his next idea that he'll protect even those he hates, and is able to run off Mosh and Graves and keep them from trying to kill Elhokar and get Elhokar to safety. Shallan does get to the Oathgate. We find out it was actually Reread who was scratching numbers based on his surges. And then we have all kinds of actions kind of going on everywhere here. Adolin fighting Eshonai. He's able to knock her off of one of the plateaus. And then Seth shows up to kill Dalinar again. And it's just kind of everything going on in general. And these scenes simultaneously, there's so much going on, and there's such great scenes. Seeing Kaladin get his blade for the first time, seeing Dalinar fighting Seth again, really, really good. And we see Dalinar and Adolin and Bridge 4, everybody, they can't defeat Seth. And then we see Kaladin come from the sky to save the day, because he finally still has ideals. He has his Surge Binding, he has Syl back. We then see Shallan actually use Pattern her blade to activate the Oathgate to Uruthuru, so can't really hide the fact that she has it anymore. Kaladin defeats Seth in the storm. In general, I have the old version before it was changed, I'll note, but it's the storm technically kills Seth in the continuity, and everybody reunites in Uruthuru in general. We see the war camp starting to head there from the Shattered Plains as well. We see Bridge 4 becoming squires to Kaladin, and Lopin's arm starting to actually heal, so he won't be one-armed anymore. And then Mosh finally kind of realizing as he escapes with Graves that he's in over his head, and he really was in it for the revenge, didn't realize what he was doing, but now he's too important of a piece. We get then the full truth of Shallan's mother in general, that Shallan did kill her, but it was because her mother and her mother's lover were trying to kill her, potentially because they were terrified of her becoming a surge binder and pattern her spren and thinking it was something evil. So she defended herself, and her father covered it up, pretended it was him, and ended up destroying his own life and the lives of the whole family to protect her from that. So that thing where it really shows her conflicting emotion of how she loved her father and knew what her father did for her, but he was also a terrible, terrible person. So we finally get that full story. That was a truth that she needed to say in order to advance in her powers as well. We see Seth restored to life by the Herald of Justice, Nail, and given Nightblood, and still one of my favorite little end scenes where he just says, Nightblood, hello, would you like to destroy some evil today? And so excited to see more of that in general, because I love it every time I read it. And then another shocking twist, we see Adolin just straight up kill Sidious in general, which was very unexpected and will play a big part going forward as well. And Dalinar binding the Stormfather himself as his spren, Reread confirmed to also be a Radiant, and Kaladin deciding that he has to go try to save his parents before the Everstorm gets back and gets them. So a ton going on and a ton set up for the next book. That's the end of part 5. In the epilogue, we see Wit waiting in the middle of nowhere, and who would show up but Yasna. I like how they showed the possibility of bringing somebody back to an extent with Seth a moment before, but she's been in Shadesmar this entire time planning, and she came to warn the others of everything that just happened, and she's a little bit too late. But her being back, once again, sets up something extremely important, because that's going to play a massive role in what is to come. So I know I've been talking for quite a while. There's just, of course, a lot to unpack with this book. But that is Words of Radiance. I will be doing a video for Edge Dancer as well. And then Oathbringer after that. And, of course, Rhythm of War once it's out. Let me know what your thoughts are on this, if you disagree with my comments or my opinions on different pieces that happened. Hopefully this was helpful to give you a general kind of overview of what is going on. If you like this video, then feel free to give it a like, and if you want to see more content like this, then feel free to subscribe.